Raising a socially successful child. Teaching kids the nonverbal language they need to communicate, connect, and thrive. By Stephen Nowicki. Introduction. A new kind of trouble. Anyone who does anything to help a child is a hero to me. During the 1990s, I found myself deeply involved in trying to solve a mystery. Troubled children who were being referred to my clinical psychology practice were struggling socially, yet their problems had no clear cause. One of my patients, a 9-year-old boy named Greg, was a good example. Greg seemed typical in almost every way imaginable. He got decent grades at school, could swing a bat as well as most kids his age, liked to run and play all kinds of games, enjoyed adventure-themed movies, and had a dog named Randy who he taught to roll over and beg. His favorite meal was pizza with extra cheese and a giant Dr. Pepper. Greg was neurotypical. He had no obvious learning, psychiatric, or developmental disorders. His dad, an accountant, and mom, who worked part-time at a clothing consignment shop, loved Greg. And though they wanted him to achieve in school, they didn't put excessive pressure on him. He attended a public school with a good reputation and had helpful, compassionate teachers. And yet something was very wrong. Greg wasn't happy. He had no friends, and he couldn't understand why. None of the other kids seemed to want to run around and play with him, or go with him to the movies, or invite him over to eat cheese pizza with extra cheese. He didn't want to be alone, yet he was. Both his parents and his teachers were concerned enough about Greg to suggest an evaluation. That's where my colleague Marshall Duke and I became a part of his story, and he became a part of ours. We began our clinical assessment by observing Greg at school, where he was experiencing the most social difficulties. On the playground at recess time, we immediately noticed that he walked around the periphery of the groups of children playing their games, never joining in. Others easily entered or left the games, but Greg stayed on the sidelines, looking lost. It was obvious that he wanted to play with the others, but all he could manage was hesitant observation. Later that afternoon, we asked Greg about his classmates. "The thing is," he said, "I like being with them. I just wish they liked being with me." As fathers with children about Greg's age at the time, his answer broke our hearts. As clinical psychologists, we were perplexed. And Greg wasn't the only patient experiencing these issues. In fact, he was one of many. Another child, Lucy, was being picked on by her classmates for reasons that eluded both her teachers and her parents. Her parents had moved her to a new school because they suspected that her previous school, with unruly classmates and unhelpful teachers, had caused the problem. But she and her parents were now confronting the fact that a new environment with a new group of children and new set of teachers hadn't made any difference. The answer lay elsewhere. Greg and his socially disconnected peers had no obvious intellectual, physical, or emotional shortcomings. What were they lacking? What were they doing wrong? My colleague and I were practicing clinical psychologists, but we were also extensively trained in scientific theory and research methodology. As it turned out, we would need both to solve the puzzle of why these children weren't fitting in. Looking for clues. Like detectives at the center of any good mystery, we searched widely and diligently for clues. The first came through our experience as consultants to public school programs for neurodivergent children and adolescents. We knew that kids with developmental disabilities often struggled socially, behaving in ways that other children found off-putting. For these kids, 9 times out of 10, their social problems had to do with their lack of nonverbal communication skills. Nonverbal skills are all the ways that people communicate with one another without using words. Facial expressions, body language, physical touch, tone of voice, the rhythmic back and forth of our interactions, and the amount of space we leave between ourselves and others. Children with developmental disabilities often have trouble with eye contact or lack the ability to fall into the rhythm of a conversation, and they may use personal space and body language inappropriately. We began to wonder if neurotypical kids like Greg and Lucy might also be struggling with these kinds of nonverbal skills that can be so vital to making and sustaining friendships. The next clue that nonverbal communication might be associated with Greg's and Lucy's relationship struggles came from my interactions with young psychotherapy clients. I noticed that many of them would enter a therapy session with clenched fists and angry faces, but when I asked why they were angry or upset, they would respond with surprise and deny feeling that way. Verbally, they were telling me that they felt happy or relaxed, but their body language told quite another story. As a young psychotherapist, I had trained with disciples of Harry Stack Sullivan, the father of American psychiatry, who suggested that children and adolescents who unknowingly communicated incongruently, that is, they sent one emotional message verbally while simultaneously sending a different one nonverbally, often struggle to form intimate friendships. I began to wonder if incongruent communication might be a factor in the social difficulties I was seeing in my clients. At the same time, it was obvious that these children were completely unaware of how their nonverbal language was at odds with their words and the negative effect it might be having on others. All these pieces of information gleaned from observing a variety of children began to fit together to form a clearer picture of why kids like Greg and Lucy might be struggling. Putting it together. Back in the 90s, when I first met Greg and Lucy, it was widely assumed that for any child who didn't have an obvious developmental psychiatric or learning disorder, nonverbal communication was an innate skill, something they instinctively learned to do in the same way that they might learn to crawl or walk. Moreover, while the topic of nonverbal communication might occasionally pop up in a newspaper or magazine article about how to discern secret signs that someone liked you or how to tell if someone was lying, it wasn't believed to play a significant role in social relationships. Marshall Duke and I, however, were coming to a much different conclusion. We decided to conduct a study in which we administered tests to children, measuring their ability to identify emotion in facial expressions and tones of voice. And indeed, we found that the poorer the children performed on these assessments, the more trouble they had making friends and feeling good about themselves. In other words, the children we studied were much more likely to be able to make friends and succeed socially if they could correctly identify and interpret nonverbal cues in faces and voices. We continued to study this connection between nonverbal ability and social success until in 1992, we published our findings in a book we called Helping the Child Who Doesn't Fit In, which drew on our research and clinical observations to address the struggles of children like Greg and Lucy and many others who just couldn't seem to get relationships right. These children badly wanted other kids to like them. But the harder they tried, the more others pushed them away. They're like pieces of a puzzle that do not fit in, we wrote at the time. They are the square pegs, the fifth wheels, the ones who are picked last for teams, the children who sit alone in the corner of the playground wondering why others don't like them. Sometimes they're called hurtful names, such as nerd, geek, and weirdo. At other times, they're treated as if they don't exist. We were certain we discovered something hugely significant, that children who struggle socially often have difficulties with nonverbal communication as well. And the media thought so too. We were invited to explain our discoveries to Oprah Winfrey, who devoted an entire show to our findings. And we presented our idea to national audiences on Good Morning America and The Today Show. Daniel Goleman later referred us heavily in his best-selling book, Emotional Intelligence. We were recognized for our research and clinical contributions by the American Psychological Association and schools in the United States, Europe, especially Britain, and elsewhere in the world began implementing our recommended therapies for struggling kids with positive results. The goal of our book was to put parents, teachers, speech therapists, psychologists, and school administrators on alert to something they haven't given much thought, but that might be very important in determining whether children would be socially successful. We had only begun to scratch the surface of what needed to be known about the role nonverbal language plays in the social lives of kids. But it was a start. We knew the world would change in ways that impacted how kids connect and engage with one another. But we never imagined that it would change radically enough to require a comprehensive overhaul of our methods and recommendations, along with a new call to action for parents, teachers, and all those who care about children's ability to develop positive, healthy relationships in childhood and throughout their adult lives. Until now. This book will bring you up to speed on the most exciting developments in the field of nonverbal communication and skill development over the past 2 decades and introduce you to all the latest findings about the language of social success. And it will provide you, parents, teachers, and caregivers alike, with a new approach to helping children succeed socially at a time when it is needed more than ever. Kids in crisis. There's no doubt in my mind that when children learn this nonverbal language of relationships, they have a greater chance of thriving in life. But giving our children this wonderful advantage is more challenging than it has been at any other point in history. The world of human interaction has changed dramatically since I was a kid. When I was growing up, I was free to roam around my neighborhood with my friends for hours on end. Every neighbor knew my name and where I lived and greeted me with smiles when they saw me. I came from a large extended family with grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, constantly in and out of our family home, and so my days were filled with the faces, voices, postures, gestures, rhythm, and yes, the touch of being with others. These varied communication styles provided me with an amazing number of examples of how to let others know how I felt and what to look for to find out what was going on inside of them. Sadly, parents today have a much harder time exposing kids to such a rich array of relationships. Many of us live far apart from extended family in much more atomized living environments than the one I grew up in. What's more, screens have come to dominate all our days, children and adults alike, leaving our children with a lot less time to learn about the intricate nonverbal back and forth of relationships. As I sit down to write this book in 2023, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic that has disrupted our children's lives in ways that seemed unfathomable just a few years before. Parents, educators, and groups that support children's psychological well-being had declared a mental health crisis, and many are deeply worried about the social and emotional developmental ground this generation of children has lost to Zoom schooling, masking, and prolonged periods of lockdown. Yet even before COVID-19 shut down their schools and their social lives, the youngest members of the most troubled generation in history, Generation Z, were already stressed to the max. Statistics on loneliness rates in children prior to 2000 are sparse, but we now know that the number of children who feel isolated and adrift has risen dramatically during the 21st century, due in part to increases in social media, cell phone, and internet use. While most of us have felt isolated and down at one time or another, the kind of chronic loneliness these kids were experiencing can have serious social consequences. Repeated failures to meaningfully connect with others can produce anxiety and even depression, and obsessing about botched efforts to connect may lead to feelings of dismay, frustration, or even anger toward others they perceive as making friendships harder to create. In 2021, the first ever national survey of loneliness revealed that a staggering number of people of all ages were experiencing loneliness, even prior to the pandemic. But the loneliest of all were children between the ages of 10 and 12, with more than 1 out of 10 admitting to feeling lonely most of the time. Not surprisingly, the upsurge in loneliness parallels increased rates of anxiety and depression. According to the National Survey of Children's Health, anxiety-related problems were found in about 3 in 100 children ages 2 to 17 in 2007. By 2016, that number had more than doubled to well over 7 in 100. Though rates of depression haven't been rising as steeply as rates of anxiety, the number of children who reported struggles with depression jumped more than 50%, from 2 in 100 children in 2007 to over 3 in 100 in 2016. If that weren't bad enough, the decade between 2007 and 2016 saw a spectacular upswing in children diagnosed as conduct disordered. Conduct disorder is a term applied to children who show an ongoing pattern of aggression toward others, as well as serious violations of rules and social norms at home, in school, and with peers. These rule violations may involve anything from patterns of misbehavior to breaking the law resulting in arrest. Compared to others, children with conduct disorder not only are more likely to have difficulty getting along with peers, but often report being lonely as well. The number of kids to receive this diagnosis skyrocketed from 3 in 100 in 2007 to 7 in 100 in 2016. Then came the pandemic, which escalated what was already a serious set of problems into a full-blown crisis, one that will likely affect young people for years to come. In a 2020 article in The Lancet, British psychologist Samantha Brooks and her colleagues described how past pandemics had left a trail of psychological damage in the form of post-traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, anger, frustration, boredom, separation anxiety, and feelings of uncertainty. And it turns out that the COVID-19 pandemic is following suit. An article published by Joan Hope describing the impact of the pandemic on children with disabilities opens with a message by Susan B. Goldberg, President Joe Biden's acting Assistant Secretary of Education at the time, illustrating just how much stress and strain the past 2 years had brought on our children. Published in July 2021, the report Hope quoted, titled Education in a Pandemic, The Disparate Impacts of COVID-19 on America's Students, revealed that nearly 3 in 10 parents surveyed in a Gallup poll said their child was experiencing harm to their emotional or mental health, with 45% citing the separation from teachers and classmates as a major challenge. And educators, parents, and administrators across the country continued to cite social and emotional well-being as major challenges facing their students, especially those learning from home. Meanwhile, suicidal ideation was also on the rise among children and young adults, as shutdowns and social isolation undermined many students' mental and emotional well-being. Even those with less severe responses still overwhelmingly reported an increase in negative feelings during the pandemic, as did many of their parents. During the pandemic, rates of anxiety and depression in children doubled again in the United States, this time in just 2 years, whereas it had previously taken an entire decade. And the United States is not alone. In 2022, the World Health Organization reported that this rise in children's mental health difficulties is a worldwide phenomenon, identifying social isolation as a probable precipitating factor. In a telling study originating in China, researchers examined a sample group of 2,330 school children, who were on lockdown for a little over a month, a relatively brief period compared to what American children had to tolerate. By the end of that month, more than 20% of the children, 1 in 5, reported anxiety and depressive symptoms. Throughout the pandemic, I heard one story after another about children having meltdowns while cooped up at home. Worse yet were the stories of children who became detached, withdrawn, and unmotivated, transforming into zombies, as their parents put it. One mother told me she felt stuck between a rock and a hard place because while she was concerned that her daughter was spending all day and a good portion of the night connected to TikTok, her attempt to curtail use of the phone caused her daughter to burst into tears and protest she was too lonely without the connection the device gave her to others. Meanwhile, there's evidence that pandemic-induced stress has hit children with poor social skills harder than others. Throughout the pandemic, Teachers lamented their inability to provide all children not only with adequate academic instruction, but social instruction as well. They were frustrated by their inability to connect with students in a meaningful way. In 2022, one researcher found that students returning to school after COVID 19 lockdowns were struggling with social interactions such as turn taking and making friends, while also experiencing delays in speech language learning. In a national survey of educators administered by the EdWeek Research Center in January 2022, 39% of respondents said that compared to prior to the pandemic in 2019, the social skills and emotional maturity levels of their current students are much less advanced. 41% said their students were somewhat less advanced in those areas, and 16% said they were about the same as their pre-pandemic peers. One exhausted third grade teacher I spoke to said she had trouble sleeping at night because she knew she was not able to provide her students with the social and emotional tools they needed more than ever during this difficult period. Yet it was the children who were having difficulties before the pandemic, she told me, that really kept her up at night. These are the real victims in this crazy way I've had to try and teach over the past 2 years. Some were having trouble finding their way before, but now I'm afraid they are completely lost. I've experienced this stress and frustration in my own teaching as well. I'm dealing with college students, most of them the older members of Gen Z, but they too are suffering. My fear is that without intervention, younger children who have fallen behind in their social and emotional development will struggle with these skills even more once they reach the age of my students and thereafter. When I meet with teachers, they often provide me with examples of what one called pandemic pandemonium. One shared what she experienced during an in-person class that took place soon after virtual teaching ended. As she had done often in the past, she split the class into groups and told them to assemble in different areas of the classroom to work together on a simple project she had carefully described beforehand. The first unnerving thing that happened was nothing. The children were silent. Rather than noisily making their way to the assigned work areas as she expected, children froze in place and had to be coaxed to move over and join their group. Once the students managed to assemble, she was further dismayed to find they had no idea of how to work with one another. They argued, they jostled, and they complained. Noticeably absent were smiles and laughter. Living under the constant isolation and stress of the pandemic had robbed them of the ability to enjoy being and working with their classmates. But while incidents like these have become more common and more frequent as a result of the pandemic, they were occurring in pre-pandemic times as well. What this tells us is that masking, Zoom school, and lockdowns only exacerbated an existing problem. Namely, children aren't learning the social skills they need to thrive. Even before COVID isolation, children had far less access to the kinds of situations and interactions necessary for learning nonverbal skills than did previous generations. with more time being spent on the internet than on the playground, and more conversations taking place over text messages and group chats rather than over a shared activity or get together. While much of the focus of research into screen use has been on adolescents, recent attention has been directed toward evaluating the negative effect on younger children too. In one study, following 4-year-old children on their journey through elementary school, researchers from Large Wickstrom's psychological laboratory found that by 8 years of age, children who spent more time on screens were less likely to rate highly in emotional intelligence. The impact that this decline in actual face-to-face interactions has had on nonverbal language ability cannot be underestimated. Consider the results from a 2019 study by Yalda Ols, a professor at UCLA's Center for Scholars and Storytellers, which followed 2 groups of 12-year-old girls on a somewhat brief summer camp experience. One group was allowed to bring their smartphones with them to camp. The other was not. Before and after the camp experience, both groups of girls completed a test that measured their ability to identify emotion in the facial expression of their peers. All found that after just 5 days, the girls who left their smartphones at home significantly improved their scores, while those who took their phones with them did not. All it took to enhance this important skill, in this instance, was substituting screen time with person-to-person time for just 5 days. While it's not realistic in our digital age to wean young people off technology entirely, we do need to carefully examine which types of on- and offline experiences facilitate their growth as social beings and which interfere with it. There is still much we don't know about the effect of screens on our children, but one thing we do know is that children learn nonverbal skills through face-to-face interaction with others, and that they are less able to learn those skills via the interface of a screen. The less interaction, the less opportunity for learning. And the less skilled children are nonverbally, the more difficult it will be for them to succeed socially in childhood and beyond. A crucial crossroads. Our children have a basic need to feel connected to one another and to the important adults in their lives. And while there is no one explanation for why so many of our kids are struggling to connect, it's clear that one of the most significant factors has been the erosion of their nonverbal language skills. Skills necessary for developing and deepening the relationships with others. To become socially successful, children must know how to take turns in a conversation and how to make the appropriate eye contact when listening and speaking to others. They need to know how loud to talk in a classroom versus on the playground, how close they can stand next to others without making them uncomfortable, and when it's okay to link arms with a friend or classmate, and when it's not. They need to be able to sync up with another child's vocal rhythms and identify the emotions they and others are conveying in their facial expressions and tones of voice. And they need to know how to stand up straight with shoulders back to project confidence, nod, and smile with encouragement when a friend is speaking. Project a friendly face even when not interacting with anyone, and all the other nonverbal skills necessary for connecting with and deepening relationships with others. Unfortunately, today, we are seeing more and more bright, academically successful, neurotypical children whose nonverbal communication skills aren't developing as they should be. And without the benefit of such skills, putting a child in a room with other kids and expecting them to make friends becomes nearly as unrealistic as handing a book to a child who doesn't know how to read and expecting him to understand the meanings of the words. The good news is that nonverbal language is teachable at any age. These skills aren't binary, as in a child either has the skill or she doesn't. They exist on a continuum, which means that whatever a kid's current skill level might be, there's always room for improvement, especially given that children will need to continuously acquire more advanced skills as they become older and seek more mature relationships. Nor are these skills all or nothing. Most children will acquire certain nonverbal skills more easily than others. For example, some kids may be adept at reading facial expressions, but be less skilled at picking up emotion in tones of voice, and vice versa. And just because a child may not have learned as much as they should have at earlier ages, it does not mean that they will be doomed to a lifetime of social rejection and isolation. It simply means that they need help catching up. It doesn't mean that there is something wrong with your child either. Just as a child who is a bit behind in math or reading may need a little extra help to get back up to grade level, a child who is lagging behind her peers in nonverbal ability can easily catch up with the benefit of extra instruction and guidance. These crucial nonverbal skills might not be ones you've ever considered directly teaching your child. Like most parents, you've probably been hyper-focused on your child's verbal skills, celebrating when your baby uttered his first word or spoke his first sentence. I remember my wife and I excitedly memorialized our son Andy's first word in a diary we still have. Yet no one writes down the date that an infant first turns his head to gaze in the direction of someone's voice, or points at something for the first time, or successfully waits his turn before playing with a toy with another child, despite the fact that each is an important milestone in children's social and emotional development. At school, children are drilled in spelling, grammar, and writing, and receive immediate feedback on whether their answers are right or wrong, yet are left to learn the nuances of nonverbal communication on their own, without the focus given to the shiny supernova of spoken words. We simply don't teach nonverbal skills in the same systematic, formalized way that we teach verbal language, and so children can very easily fall behind. With nonverbal communication mostly flying under the radar, the majority of parents and caregivers have no idea how powerful their influence on a child's acquisition of nonverbal language can be. As a parent, you're probably exceedingly careful about the words you use and the thoughts you express around your children, lest they repeat those things at school or on the playground. But you may not give any thought to the nonverbal language you use, or how your children might be absorbing and mimicking those forms of expression, such as speaking in a monotone or sitting with a slumped posture, or failing to make encouraging nods and smiles when listening to someone speak. Like many attentive and loving parents, you may have no idea that your child had fallen behind when it comes to nonverbal skills, or perhaps you had some awareness that your child was struggling, but just weren't sure that what you could do to help. The good news is that nonverbal skills are easy to teach and easy for kids to learn. In fact, the research shows that with some awareness and practice, they can be fully mastered. Raising a socially successful child addresses the two greatest challenges we face in ensuring that our kids are equipped with the social and emotional skills they need to thrive. An increasingly online culture that deprioritizes face-to-face interaction, and the myriad effects of a pandemic that has kept young people isolated or masked during some of the most pivotal years of their social development. Unfortunately, these two forces have fed off each other, accelerating children's nonverbal decline. Whether they know it or not, parents, caregivers, and teachers all over the world are at a crossroads. The time to act is now. As a parent, there is a great deal you can do to help, but teachers and school personnel play an equally important role in providing the kinds of supportive, corrective experiences children need. Schools, after all, are where children spend most of their day. Interacting with their peers under the watchful gaze of teachers who can create innumerable and abundant opportunities for social learning and give children the experience, practice, and help they need to learn how to communicate better nonverbally. Rather than trust that children will inevitably and naturally pick up these skills, you can play a crucial and active role in their nonverbal education. Throughout this book, you'll find simple tips and activities you can use to help your child improve her nonverbal abilities. These include how to show your child how to be respectful of the personal space of other children, how to help her learn to read emotional cues in facial expressions, how to use touch appropriately, and how to fall into the rhythm of turn-taking in conversations. These easy-to-follow teaching tools are backed by scientific theory and research and yield significant results. They are designed to be simple and painless for parents and teachers to practice with kids. My goal in writing this book is to support parents, caregivers, and educators as they help today's children negotiate the increasingly complex but ultimately rewarding task of relating to others as they venture out into the world. First as children, then as adolescents and young adults. This book will guide you in helping your child recover the social skills she may have lost during more than 2 years of pandemic life and develop the more advanced skills she needs to tackle the enduring challenges she may face in the years ahead. With this foundation, not only will your child have a better chance of social and emotional success in childhood and adolescence, but she also will be better equipped to forge meaningful and long-lasting relationships and achieve workplace success as an adult. As was the case for Greg and Lucy, the young children with the mysterious cause for their lack of friendships, a little practice is often all that is needed to address problem areas and improve a child's life. I believe this book can provide you with the knowledge and tools you need to do just that. It is my singular mission to make that happen.